Eleanor Fairfax had spent 15 years teaching herself not to flinch, and on the morning the Duke of Halstead came up the lane in a black carriage, with his crest freshly repainted, she did not flinch then either. She did not call out. She did not step back. She set one hand flat against the shoulder of the boy standing in the doorway in front of her, and left it there, and with the other hand she touched, without seeming to notice she had done it, the ribbon at her throat where something small and hard hung hidden beneath her collar. The boy did not move. His name was Thomas, and he was 14 years old, and he had his father's black hair and his mother's flat, unimpressed stare, though he did not yet know that the second thing was inherited any more than the first. He stood square in the doorframe with both hands braced against the wood on either side of him, the way a much smaller boy might have braced against a door he intended to hold shut against a storm, and he watched a duke come up the garden path in polished boots that had never once touched a furrow, and he did not move. "Thomas," the duke said, and stopped 2 yards short of the step, as if some instinct in him understood that the distance mattered. "I have come a long way to see you." "Then you have come a long way for nothing," the boy said, "because I am not going anywhere," and behind him Eleanor Fairfax said nothing at all, because there was nothing yet that needed saying, and because the boy was, in this at least, entirely right. By the end of that summer, the man in the doorway would call her by a name he had not spoken aloud in 15 years, and the boy would wear, openly, on his own hand, the thing his mother had hidden under her collar since before he could walk. But that was not yet. That morning there was only a duke on a garden path, a boy in a doorway, and a woman between them, and the particular silence of a house deciding, all at once, whether it was about to be invaded or rescued. The spring of 1801 had come to Fenwick the way it always came, indifferent and green, with the lambing finished and the first fen mist burned off by 9 each morning, and nobody in the parish had thought there was anything remarkable about a land agent's daughter walking out most evenings with the young man who was, though almost no one in the village knew it yet. The heir to a dukedom. Eleanor Fairfax had grown up on ledgers the way other girls grew up on scripture. Her father, who managed 400 acres for an estate that was not his own and never complained of the distinction, had taught her to read a soil report before she could properly read a novel, and had told her, more times than she could count, that land will tell you the truth if you know how to look at it, and paper will tell you the truth if you know how to keep it. She had believed him. She still did. Julian Harcourt had been 22 that spring, heir to a dukedom he did not yet hold, and did not yet understand the weight of, and he had loved Eleanor Fairfax with the specific desperate seriousness of a young man who has been raised entirely without being asked what he wants. They were married in April, quietly, in a stone church 3 parishes distant from either of their fathers, by a clergyman named Josiah Wren, who had known Eleanor since her christening, and who signed the register himself, in his own hand, and told them both, with the particular gravity of a man who does not often say such things, that he did not marry people lightly, and did not expect either of them to treat the sacrament lightly either. They had not intended to treat it lightly. They had simply not yet understood what it would cost. The old Duke found out in November, when Eleanor was already carrying the child who would become Thomas, and what followed was not shouted, because men like the 7th Duke of Halstead did not shout. It was managed instead with the cold, unhurried thoroughness of a man closing an account he considered improperly opened. He did not threaten his son with disinheritance outright. Not at first, he simply explained, in the manner of a man reading aloud from a ledger, exactly what would happen to Eleanor's father's position, to her younger brother's naval commission, to the small holding her family had occupied for 3 generations if the marriage were not quietly undone. He had, by then, already found the means to undo it, a bribed curate willing to swear the register had been improperly witnessed, a claim of an earlier informal understanding that could be dressed up as a prior contract, the whole apparatus of a man who had spent a lifetime learning that reputation could be rewritten by anyone patient enough and rich enough to hold the pen. Julian signed the paper his father put in front of him on a morning in January, 3 weeks before his son was born, and he did not do it because he stopped loving Eleanor Fairfax. He did it because his father showed him, item by item, everything that would be destroyed if he did not, and because he was 22, and afraid, and had been taught since infancy that a duke's first duty was to the house and not to himself. He told himself, signing it, that he would find a way to undo it later, once his father was dead, once he held the power himself. He did not yet know how long a man could go on telling himself that, or how completely the telling could come to resemble forgetting. Eleanor was given £400, and a letter explaining that the marriage had never been valid, and told, by a man who was not her husband and would not meet her eyes, that the child, when it came, would have no claim on anyone. She took £40 of the 400 because her mother had raised her to be proud, rather than foolish, and sent the rest back unopened, and she left the county before anyone could ask her to explain herself, and she did not weep where anyone could see her do it. She permitted herself grief the way her father had taught her to permit herself anything expensive, in a fixed counted amount, spent deliberately, and then set aside. 10 minutes, she decided, on the day the child was born, and 10 minutes on his birthday every year after, and not 1 minute more, because a woman with a child to raise, and no name to raise him under, did not have grief to spare beyond that, and everything else went into the drawer she kept, in her mind, for things she could not yet afford to feel. She built, in the years that followed, a life that owed nothing to any Harcourt. She took her father's trade north, to a country where no one knew her name, made herself indispensable first as a clerk, and then as an agent to an elderly widow's 400 acres at Ashcombe Grange, turned a property that had run at a loss of £340 a year into one that returned a surplus, and raised a boy who called her mother and asked, occasionally, in the unguarded way of children, why he had no father, and was told, truthfully as far as it went, that his father had not been free to come. She wore, hidden beneath her collar on a ribbon no one but Thomas had ever seen, a signet ring too small for any adult hand, the ring Julian Harcourt had pressed into her palm the night before he signed his father's paper. The only thing that had ever been entirely his own to give her, and she had told herself for 15 years that she kept it only as evidence, only as a document like any other, and had known, every one of those 15 years, that this was not entirely true. The letter announcing the Duke's visit came on a Tuesday in June, in a hand she had not seen in 15 years, and recognised anyway before she had read 3 words of it, and she read it once, standing in the hall with the boy's boots still muddy by the door where he had left them. And then she folded it along its original crease, and went to find Thomas, because whatever else was true, he deserved to hear it from her before he heard it from a stranger's mouth on his own doorstep. She told him plainly, the way her father had taught her to deliver any hard news, the facts first, the feelings after, and only if asked. He listened without interrupting, in the way that had always unsettled people who expected 14-year-old boys to be less composed than their mothers, and when he finished, he asked only one question, which was whether the man intended to take him away, and she told him the truth, which was that she did not yet know, and that whatever the man intended, it would not happen without her consent, and without a fight she intended to win. That was the Tuesday. By Saturday the black carriage was coming up the lane, and the boy was standing in the doorway with both hands braced against the frame, and Eleanor Fairfax was touching, without meaning to, the ribbon at her throat, and the Duke, who had signed away his son at 3 weeks old, was walking up a garden path toward the two people he had spent 15 years failing to forget. The Duke of Halstead had rehearsed this moment for 6 weeks, on the road and off it, and none of the rehearsals had accounted for the boy's stillness. He had imagined tears, or shouting, or the particular chaos of a household unprepared for grandeur arriving on its doorstep. He had not imagined a boy who looked at him the way a man looks at a bill he intends to dispute. "You will want to come inside," Eleanor said, because someone had to say something, and it was her house, and she was not going to conduct this conversation in a garden where the vicar's wife could watch it from the lane. "Both of you. This is not a discussion for a doorstep." "On the contrary," the Duke said, "I find the doorstep suits me very well," and something in his voice, not cruelty, she noted, but the brittle formality of a man who has built his whole life on not saying the true thing, made her understand that he had come with a speech prepared, and that the speech was the only armour he had brought. He looked at Thomas for a long moment before he spoke again, the particular hunger of a man cataloguing a face he has only imagined until now. And then he said the thing he had, in fact, rehearsed, the thing that would come back to him later with the exact weight of a debt called in. "He is my heir," the Duke said to Eleanor, as though the boy standing between them could not hear it. "Whatever has passed between us, that fact does not change. I have no other son, and my line will not continue through a cousin I would not trust with a dog, let alone a dukedom. I have come to do my duty by him." "Your duty," Eleanor repeated, and there was nothing in her voice that could be called anger, only the flat precision of a woman reading a figure back to confirm it had been heard correctly. 15 years, and the word you have brought me is duty. What word would you have me bring?" "I would have you bring nothing," she said. "I did not send for you." "He did not send for you." "You are welcome to state your business, my lord, but you will state it to both of us, and you will state it plainly, because that is the only kind of conversation that happens in this house." Mrs. Pruitt, who had kept house for Eleanor for 11 years, and had opinions about dukes that she had never troubled to disguise, appeared in the hall behind them with a look that suggested she would be fetching the fire-iron if this went on much longer, and said nothing at all, which from Mrs. Pruitt was itself a kind of statement. "I have papers," the Duke said. "A settlement, recognition before witnesses. He would want for nothing, an education, a name, a future no county agent's cottage could give him. He has an education," Eleanor said. "He reads 4 languages and can audit a rent roll faster than most men twice his age. He has a name. It is mine, and it has never once been withdrawn from him, which is more than can be said of yours." The Duke absorbed that the way a man absorbs a blow he privately believes he has earned, and turned, at last, to the boy himself, and tried again, more quietly. "Thomas, I know this is a great deal to be told on a doorstep. I would ask only that you consider—" "I have considered it," Thomas said. "You signed a paper that said I wasn't yours. Now you've got a paper that says I am. I don't much care for people who change their minds about me, depending on which paper is in front of them." It was, Eleanor thought, exactly the sort of thing she might have said herself at 14, if she had ever had the nerve, and she felt something in her chest that was not quite pride and not quite grief, and set it aside to be examined later, because there was no time for it now. "You will not be taken from this house today, or any day against your will," she told Thomas. Loudly enough that the Duke could hear it as clearly as the boy did. "That is not a promise I am making lightly. It is one I intend to keep whatever it costs. And if I contest it," the Duke said, "in law, then you will find," Eleanor said, "that I have spent 15 years learning exactly how the law regards a woman who kept every document you were foolish enough to think she would burn." She let that sit a moment. "You may come in, my lord, and take tea, and say whatever it is you actually came to say, once you have decided to say it honestly. Or you may go back down that path the way you came. But you will not stand in my garden and call 15 years of neglect a duty, because I have buried better excuses than that." The Duke looked, for just a moment, like a man who has walked a long way to deliver a speech, and discovered, on arrival, that the speech was wrong. He did not go back down the path. He came in, and took the tea he was offered, and said almost nothing for the better part of an hour. And Eleanor watched him watch the boy pour milk for the housekeeper before pouring his own, an ordinary, unremarkable courtesy that seemed, in the Duke's face, to land like a blow. When he left that evening, without the boy, without a signature, without the settlement papers so much as unfolded, Eleanor stood again in the doorway and watched the carriage go, and permitted herself exactly as much feeling as she had ever permitted herself on days that cost something. And then she went to find pen and paper, because a man who had come once with papers would come again, and this time she intended to have better ones waiting. "We're not going anywhere," Thomas said again, from the stairs, not a question. "No," she said, "but we are going to win, and there is a difference between standing still and simply refusing to move. I intend to do both." She looked at him a long moment. "Get your boots. We start at Ashcombe at first light. If that man wants to understand what he threw away, he had better learn to recognise what it looks like when it is doing its work." The trouble that had come up the lane in a black carriage did not go back down, it changed, not yet. But the woman who watched it go was already, by the time the dust settled, no longer the same woman who had opened the door. The following morning, before the mist had properly lifted off the low fields at Ashcombe Grange, a rider Eleanor did not recognise was seen asking questions in the village about a Mrs. Fairfax and a boy of 14, and asking them, the miller's wife later reported, in a manner that suggested he already knew most of the answers and was only confirming them for someone else's benefit. Ashcombe Grange had been losing money for 11 years before Eleanor Fairfax took the agency, and everyone in the county who cared to have an opinion about it had one, mostly unkind, mostly directed at Lady Instow, for trusting the management of 400 acres to a woman nobody's husband could quite place the origin of. Eleanor had heard every version of the opinion at least twice, and had learned early that the fastest way to silence it was not argument, but arithmetic. The problem that summer was the low meadow, 60 acres of fen ground that flooded every third year, and had, under the previous agent, simply been written off as unproductive, and left to reed and rush. Eleanor had spent 4 years arguing that it could be drained and turned to pasture, and Lady Instow, cautious with her nephew's inheritance, had finally agreed to fund it that spring, on the condition that Eleanor herself account for every shilling, in writing, before the tenants' quarter day. She walked the ditches with the drainage foreman, a blunt, sun-cured man named Josiah Ketch, who had told her plainly, the first year she came to Ashcombe, that he did not take instruction from women, and had 4 years later become the loudest defender of her competence in 3 parishes, and together they reckoned the fall of the land in inches, and the run of the water, and the number of rods of new channel required, and what it would cost against what the reclaimed acreage would return in grazing rents within 3 years. 60 acres, Ketch said, standing ankle-deep at the lowest point of the meadow, with his boots sucking at the mud, and you want it drained by Michaelmas. I want it drained by Michaelmas, Eleanor agreed, because Lady Instow's nephew comes of age at Christmas, and will want to see improvement he can point to, and because I have told him, in writing, that it can be done, and I do not make promises in writing that I cannot keep. Costly promise. £40 costly, she said. Against £90 a year in grazing once it's down to grass, which is £50 clear the first year and every year after, which is a return most men in this county would kill to put their name to. I have shown Lady Instow the figures 3 times. I will show them to you as many times as you require it. Ketch required it exactly once more, walking the line of the proposed main channel with her, while she read the fall of it off a spirit level and a chain. And by the end of the walk he had stopped calling her Mrs. Fairfax, in the careful, faintly amused tone he had used the first 3 years, and started calling her ma'am in the tone he used for men whose orders he did not question, which in Josiah Ketch's private accounting was the higher honour of the 2. The work went on through July. Trenches opened, a new sluice set at the low corner. Gangs of men from 3 parishes paid at the end of every week exactly what they had been promised, and not a day late, which was, Eleanor had learned, the single fastest way to build a reputation in a county that had grown used to landowners who paid when it suited them. She kept the accounts herself, in a ledger she had bound in plain calf and ruled by hand, every entry dated, every payment witnessed, and she began, without entirely intending to, keeping a second set of pages at the back of the same book, not accounts, but notes. Dates, names, the exact words a bribed curate had once used, recalled from a 15-year-old memory, and set down now, while there was reason to set them down at all. Thomas worked beside her most of that month, learning to read the fall of water the way she had learned it from her own father. And it was there, ankle-deep in a half-cut channel with mud to his knees and a level in his hands, that the Duke found them both on his second visit, 3 weeks after the first, standing at the edge of the meadow in boots that had, this time, clearly walked some distance to reach them. He did not announce himself. He simply stood at the field's edge for the better part of 10 minutes, watching a woman he had once married direct 40 men, and a drainage scheme with the same flat, unhurried competence with which she seemed to do everything, watching his son stand beside her reading figures off a chain with an ease that suggested he had been doing it for years. And something in his face, when Eleanor finally noticed him and straightened, had gone very still. "You did all this," he said, when she came to where he stood, "in 15 years. I did all this," she said, "because no one else was going to do it for me. That is generally how competence is acquired, my lord. Necessity, and then habit. I did not come to interrupt your work." "You are not interrupting it," she said. "You are welcome to watch, if you have nothing better to do with a Tuesday. I find most men eventually grow bored of watching other people work and leave of their own accord." He did not leave. He stood at the edge of the meadow for the rest of the afternoon, and Eleanor noted, without remarking on it, that he had, for the first time since arriving in the county, the look of a man observing something he had not expected to find. and that whatever speech he had prepared for this visit, he did not once, that whole afternoon, attempt to deliver it. That evening, walking back toward the house with Thomas ahead of them scraping mud from his boots against a stone, the Duke said, quietly, in a voice she almost did not recognise as the one that had stood in her garden 3 weeks before and spoken of duty, "He is remarkable." "He is," Eleanor agreed. "He always has been. You were not here to notice." "No," the Duke said. "I was not." He did not offer an excuse, which she noted, silently, as the first thing he had said in 15 years that resembled honesty. "May I come again next week?" "You may come," she said, "as often as you like, provided you understand that coming is not the same as being owed anything. You will earn what you find here, my lord, the same as everyone else does. I have never yet made an exception for a title." "No," he said, "I don't suppose you have." And for just a moment, walking beside her in the long gold light over a meadow he had watched her reclaim from a bog with £40 and her own 2 hands, the Duke of Halstead almost smiled, a small, uncertain thing that did not survive more than a second on his face, but that Eleanor Fairfax, cataloguing him now the way she catalogued every account that crossed her desk, noted and filed away all the same. The second time he almost smiled was 2 weeks later, and lasted, by Eleanor's private and entirely involuntary count, nearly 3 full seconds. He had come, by then, on 4 separate occasions, always announced a day in advance, always leaving before dark, and Eleanor had begun, without deciding to, measuring the visits the way she measured everything, in units, in increments, in evidence, weighed and filed. He asked questions now instead of making declarations. He asked Thomas about the drainage works, and listened to the answers without correcting them, and asked her, once, haltingly, how she had learned to read a soil report, as though the answer might tell him something about the 15 years he had not been present for. It was on the 4th visit that he told her, in the walled garden behind the house while Thomas was occupied elsewhere with Ketch and a length of new fencing, why he had signed his father's paper, and he did not tell it as an excuse, which she noted, because she had spent 15 years anticipating excuses and had a low tolerance for them. "My father did not threaten me," he said, "not directly. He was too precise a man for anything so crude. He simply explained, in full, everything that would happen to your family if I did not sign, and then he left the paper on the table and left the room, and I sat with it for the better part of a night, and in the morning I signed it, and I told myself I would undo it the moment I held the title myself." He paused. "My father lived another 11 years. I told myself that same lie for 11 years, and by the time he was dead I had told it to myself so many times that I had nearly begun to believe I had never had a choice at all." "You had a choice," Eleanor said. "You simply made the one that cost you the least that morning, and told yourself for a decade that it had been the only one available. That is not the same as having no choice. I would ask you to be honest about the difference, if you intend to go on being honest with me at all." "I am trying," he said, "to be honest with you for the first time in 15 years, and finding that I do not entirely remember how it is done." "Then I will tell you how it is done," she said. "You say the true thing, even when the true thing makes you look small. You do it consistently, not once for effect. And you do it whether or not it earns you anything, because if you are only being honest in order to be forgiven, it is not honesty, it is negotiation, and I have had quite enough of that from your family already." He was quiet a moment, turning that over. "My father is dead," he said finally. "I am Duke. I have no other heir, and no wife, and a cousin who has spent the last 3 years positioning himself to inherit everything I have and everything I might have given a son, and I came here first, if I am honest, because I needed an heir, and only later, standing in your doorway, did I understand that I had come for something else as well. That is the most honest thing you have said to me, Eleanor told him, in 15 years. It is also not enough. Needing a thing and wanting it back are different countries, my lord, and I have lived in the second one alone for a very long time. You will have to prove which country you actually live in, and paper will not do it. Only time will. He looked at her then with an expression she had not seen on his face since a stone church 3 parishes from anywhere, a long time ago, when he had been 22 and certain of nothing except her. And he said quietly, "Then I will have to be patient." And something in the plainness of it, the lack of performance in it, made her almost believe him. It was Thomas, in the end, who told her about the man asking questions in the village, because Thomas had taken to walking the lanes with Ketch's boy in the evenings, and had heard, second-hand and then third-hand, that a gentleman's servant had been in the tap-room at the Feathers, asking after the exact date of a christening that had occurred, if the register could be trusted, in a parish register some 30 miles distant, 15 years before. Eleanor did not need to be told whose servant it was. She had expected Silas Grey to make his first move for weeks, and she had spent those weeks, quietly, preparing for it. Because a woman who had learned to read a soil report before she could properly read a novel had also learned, a long time ago, that the second most useful skill in the world was knowing exactly when trouble was coming, and using the warning to get there first. "He'll come himself, soon enough," she told Thomas that night, closing her ledger and setting it, deliberately, on the shelf beside the older one, the one bound in plain calf, with a second set of pages at the back that were not accounts at all. Men like that always do, once they've decided the servants can't finish the job alone. When he does, I want you to remember that whatever he says to frighten you, he is the one who is frightened. A man secure in his claim does not need to send a servant 30 miles to ask about a christening he could simply have looked up himself. "How do you know all that?" "Because I have spent 15 years, Eleanor said, learning to read exactly this kind of trouble the way your grandfather taught me to read a flooded field. It tells you the truth if you know how to look at it. So does paper. Silas Grey is about to learn that the hard way." Silas Grey arrived at Ashcombe Grange on a wet Thursday at the end of July, uninvited. In a curricle driven too fast for the lane, and introduced himself to Eleanor with the particular warmth of a man who has decided in advance exactly how much charm a situation requires, and intends to spend no more of it than necessary. "Mrs. Fairfax," he said, bowing over her hand with a smile that did not, she noted, reach anywhere near his eyes. "Or perhaps I ought to say Mrs. Harcourt. I confess I am not entirely certain which name the law will eventually settle on." "You may call me Mrs. Fairfax," Eleanor said, "since that is the name on the deed of this agency, and the only name I have any present use for. What brings you 30 miles in weather like this, Mr. Grey?" "Family feeling," Silas said, and smiled again, the smile of a man who has practised it enough to believe it convincing. "My cousin has made a rather startling announcement to certain persons of standing in the county, that he intends to legitimise a boy born, by his own admission, under circumstances of some irregularity. I confess I have taken it upon myself to understand the irregularity rather better than my cousin, in his present state of feeling, seems inclined to. How industrious you have become, Eleanor said, on your cousin's behalf, meaning, and letting him understand that she meant. How convenient you find his sudden feeling, when the alternative costs you £40,000 a year. One does what family requires, Silas said. One does, Eleanor agreed, though I have generally found that what people call family feeling and what they mean by it are two very different sums, and the difference is usually written down somewhere for anyone patient enough to go looking. Silas's smile did not move, but something behind it did, briefly, the particular flicker of a man who has just been told, politely, that his ledger has already been read. I am told, he said, that there exists some question as to whether the ceremony in question was ever lawfully performed at all. A prior understanding, I am given to believe, existing at the time, a Mr. Josiah Croft, of this county, to whom Miss Fairfax was, I understand, informally promised before her supposed marriage to my cousin. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, the flat, unhurried look she gave a column of figures that did not balance, and said nothing at all for long enough that he shifted, very slightly in his boots. I have never in my life heard the name Josiah Croft, she said finally, which is either a remarkable coincidence, Mr. Grey, or a rather poorly chosen one. I would ask where you came by it, but I expect I will learn that soon enough on my own, and I expect, when I do, that you will regret having mentioned it to me before I had the chance to go looking. It is a matter for the courts, Mrs. Fairfax, not for a conversation in a garden. Then I look forward to the courts, Eleanor said, very much. Mr. Grey, bring your Josiah Croft. Bring whatever paper you have found to put a name to him. I have spent 15 years keeping paper of my own, and I promise you, whatever you have assembled, mine is older and mine is true, and yours, I suspect, is neither. She smiled, thinly, the first smile she had permitted herself in his presence. Good day to you. Mind the lane on your way out. It floods, this time of year, in exactly the low place your family has always preferred to ignore. Silas Grey left Ashcombe Grange considerably less warm than he had arrived, and Eleanor stood in the wet garden a long while after his curricle had gone, turning the name Josiah Croft over in her mind, because she did not recognise it, and because a name she did not recognise, attached to a claim she had never heard, was the single most dangerous kind of paper there was, the kind invented whole, built to look old, and dropped into a courtroom by a man who had every reason to hope no one still living would trouble to check the date. She went that same week to see Hannah Wren. Hannah Wren kept a small stationer's shop in the cathedral town 12 miles distant, and had kept, since her father's death 6 years before, 3 trunks of his papers in the room above it, because Josiah Wren had been the sort of clergyman who threw nothing away, and Hannah had been the sort of daughter who understood, without ever quite being told why, that some of what he had kept mattered more than the rest. He spoke of you, Hannah said, when Eleanor had explained plainly what she had come for. Not often. But I remember him saying more than once that there was a marriage he had performed as a young curate that he believed had been wronged afterward by persons with more money than conscience, and that he had made certain, whatever came of it, that the truth of it would still be findable by anyone who came looking properly. She looked at Eleanor a long moment. Was that you? That was me, Eleanor said. Hannah found the letter in the second trunk, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with her father's own private mark, addressed to no one in particular, and dated the same month the old Duke's paper had been signed, a full and careful account, in Josiah Wren's own hand, of a marriage lawfully performed between Julian Harcourt and Eleanor Fairfax in April of 1801, with the names of both witnesses recorded, and beneath it, folded separately, a certified true copy of the register page itself, made, the letter explained, the same week the original had gone missing from the parish book under circumstances Reverend Wren had not troubled to disguise his suspicion of. Eleanor read it twice, standing in the low room above the stationer's shop, with dust in the light from the window, and permitted herself, for the second time in 15 years, rather more than her allotted 10 minutes. "There is also this," Hannah said, when Eleanor had folded the letter carefully away, and held out a smaller paper, brittle with age. "A note my father kept with it. He wrote that if anyone ever came claiming a prior contract on Miss Fairfax's part, they should be asked, before anything else, to produce the name of the witnessing curate, because he had made careful inquiry at the time as to whether any such understanding existed, precisely because he suspected someone might one day try to invent one, and had found no such man in 3 parishes, living or dead, who answered to any such history." Eleanor looked up. He anticipated this, 15 years ago. "My father did not trust the old Duke," Hannah said simply. "He said once that a man who could make a marriage disappear on paper was a man who would try to make it disappear twice, if it were ever inconvenient to him a second time. He wanted you to have what you needed, whenever that second time came." Eleanor carried both papers back to Ashcombe Grange folded inside her own ledger, between the accounts and the second set of pages at the back that were not accounts at all, and that night, by candlelight, she added to those pages the name Josiah Croft, and beneath it, in her own steady hand, the words to be disproven, and the date, and felt, for the first time since the black carriage had come up the lane, something that was not quite hope, but stood very near it. It was 3 days later that she found Thomas sitting on the stairs, with the ribbon undone in his hands, the small ring resting in his palm, having found it, he admitted, not quite by accident, in the drawer where she kept it at night, when the ribbon chafed. "It's too small for a grown man," he said, turning it in the candlelight. "It would fit me, though, it would," Eleanor said, and sat down beside him on the stair, and did not take it back immediately, which was in itself a kind of decision. "Your father gave it to me the night before he signed the paper that undid us. He said it was the only thing that was entirely his to give, and not his father's, and not the dukedom's, and I have kept it 15 years telling myself it was evidence." She looked at the small worn gold in his hand. "It was never only evidence. Are you going to give it back to him?" "No," Eleanor said. "I think I am going to give it to you. It was never mine to keep forever, Thomas. It was only ever mine to keep safe until it was time." She closed his fingers over it, gently. "When the time comes that you choose to wear it, you will wear it because you decided to, and not because anyone required it of you. That is the only condition I will ever put on it." He did not answer at once. He sat turning the ring over, the small crest of a dukedom he had spent his whole life outside of catching the candlelight, and then he said, quietly, "I don't hate him. I thought I would. I mostly just don't know him yet." "That is a very fair position," Eleanor said, "and a wiser one than I managed at your age. Hold it a while longer before you decide anything further. There is no debt owed on patience, Thomas. It is the one thing in this whole business that costs nothing to spend." He put the ring, in the end, not back in her drawer but on the ribbon around his own neck, hidden the way she had once hidden it, and said nothing more about it, and Eleanor understood. watching him go up to bed with it resting under his collar, that whatever came next, the courts, Silas Gray's invented Mr. Croft, the Duke's slow, unsteady honesty, the true centre of the whole matter had just, quietly, shifted itself into the boy's own keeping, exactly where it belonged. Silas Gray's counterpunch, when it came dressed in exactly the respectability she had expected of it, a sworn affidavit, filed with the county court, and copied, within the week, to half the drawing-rooms in 3 parishes, attesting that one Josiah Croft, yeoman, of the parish of Ambury, had witnessed an informal but binding promise of marriage between Eleanor Fairfax and himself in the autumn of 1800, some 7 months before her ceremony with Julian Harcourt, rendering that later ceremony, whatever its form, void from its beginning. The affidavit was signed, notarized, and entirely convincing to anyone who did not think to ask the one question Josiah Wren had anticipated 15 years before it was needed. Eleanor asked it within a day of the paper reaching her hands. She rode to Ambury herself, with Thomas beside her and Ketch driving, and found, in the parish register there, that no Josiah Croft had ever been recorded as resident, married or buried in that parish in living memory, and found in the churchyard a stone bearing the name of a Josias Croft, spelt differently, dead of a fever 11 years before the date on which he was supposed, according to Silas Gray's sworn affidavit, to have witnessed a promise that never existed, to a woman he could not. Being 11 years in his grave have met. He didn't check the spelling, Thomas said, standing over the stone in the wet grass, or the date. He didn't think anyone would trouble to, Eleanor said. That is the mistake men like Mr. Gray nearly always make. They assume that because a lie is convenient, no one will find it inconvenient enough to disprove. She looked down at the stone a long moment. We will need this exact stone remembered, Thomas, and the sexton who can swear to it, and the register alongside it, and we will need it not in a private letter, but in front of every person in this county who has ever repeated Mr. Gray's affidavit over their tea. Paper undid us once, in a room with no witnesses. It will not undo anyone again in the dark. Whatever happens next happens in the light, where everyone can see the seams of it. She wrote that same week to the Duke, the first letter she had sent him in 15 years, informing him, plainly, that she had disproven his cousin's claim, beyond any reasonable challenge, and that she intended to make that disproof public, formally before the assembled county. At the earliest date the local bench could be persuaded to hear it, and that she expected him, if he meant one word of what he had said to her in the walled garden, to stand beside her when she did it, and not merely to send solicitors in his place. He wrote back the same day, in 4 lines, the shortest letter she had ever received from him. I will stand where you tell me to stand, he wrote. I have spent 15 years learning what it costs to stand nowhere at all. The hearing was set for the last Thursday in August, in the long room above the Corn Exchange at Fenwick, before the county magistrate, a precise, unhurried man named Edmund Colt, who had, in 30 years on the bench, developed a settled contempt for affidavits that arrived too neatly assembled, and a settled respect for anyone who brought him a ledger instead of a speech. The room was full an hour before the proceedings began, which surprised no one who had spent the summer watching Fenwick's opinion of Eleanor Fairfax turn, slowly and then all at once, the way water turns when a channel is finally cut clean through a blocked ditch. Lady Instow was there, in the front row, having decided once and for all exactly which side of this particular argument her agent's reputation had earned. Josiah Ketch was there, in his good coat, with half the drainage gang crowded behind him. Hannah Wren had come the 12 miles from the cathedral town with her father's oilcloth-wrapped letter carried, herself in both hands, refusing to entrust it to any carriage but her own lap the whole way. Silas Grey arrived last, composed, smiling the smile he had practised for exactly this kind of room, with a solicitor at his elbow and a folder of papers he had every confidence in, and took his seat with the particular ease of a man who has never yet lost an argument he had time to prepare for. Magistrate Colt called the matter to order without ceremony, and asked Mr. Grey's solicitor to state the claim, and the solicitor did at some length, reading the affidavit of the late Josiah Croft's witnessed promise into the record, with the flat confidence of a document that had never before been questioned by anyone with the patience to check it. "Mrs. Fairfax," Colt said, when the reading was finished, "you have asked to be heard. You may proceed." Eleanor stood, and did not raise her voice, because she had never needed to raise her voice to be heard by anyone worth hearing, and laid 3 things before the magistrate, one at a time, in the order she had planned them a week before in the low room above Hannah Wren's shop. The first was Reverend Wren's letter, in his own hand, with Hannah Wren herself present to swear to it, recounting the lawful marriage he had performed and the missing register page he had quietly certified against, 15 years before anyone in this room had thought to doubt it. The second was the certified true copy of that register page itself, bearing 2 witness names Colt could, if he chose, verify against parish records that very afternoon. The third was a stone. "I would ask the court's indulgence," Eleanor said, "to hear from the sexton of Ambury parish, who is present, and who will confirm what any man may confirm for himself with an afternoon's ride, that the Josiah Croft named in Mr. Grey's affidavit has lain in that churchyard, spelled somewhat differently, for 11 years, and that whatever promise he is alleged to have witnessed in the autumn of 1800, he witnessed it from beneath the ground, having died of a fever some 4 years prior to that date. The room, which had been merely attentive until that moment, went very still, the particular stillness of a crowd realizing, all at once, precisely which direction the tide had turned. Silas Grey's smile did not move for a long moment, and then very slowly it did, not into anger, which would have been easier to watch, but into the small, private collapse of a man doing arithmetic he had never expected to be asked to show his working on. His solicitor bent to speak to him urgently, and he waved the man off, and stood finally on his own, because there was nothing left for anyone else to say on his behalf. "I did not draft the affidavit myself," he said, which was, Eleanor thought, the first entirely true sentence he had spoken in that room. "No," Colt said, not unkindly, "I don't imagine you did. But you filed it, Miss Grey, and copied it to half the drawing-rooms of this county, and I would ask you, before I decide what is to be done about that, whether there is anything further you wish this court to hear." Silas Grey stood a long moment in the silence of a room that had, entirely and audibly, turned against him, and Eleanor watched something go out behind his eyes that she recognized, distantly, as the particular defeat of a man who has spent his whole life believing that patience and paper could outlast anyone, discovering, all at once, that this time they had not. "No," he said finally. "Nothing further." Magistrate Colt found, that afternoon, without needing to retire to consider it, that the marriage of Julian Harcourt and Eleanor Fairfax, performed lawfully in April of 1801, had never been dissolved by any instrument the court could recognise as valid, the so-called deed of renunciation having been procured, on the court's own reading of the surrounding evidence, under circumstances amounting to duress, and that the affidavit of one Josiah Croft was, in his own words, a fabrication so carelessly assembled that I confess myself more astonished by its author's confidence than by its content. He directed that the matter of Mr. Gray's conduct in filing it be referred, separately, for further inquiry, and it was there that Eleanor rose a second time. I would ask the court, she said, not to pursue Mr. Gray further than a public correction requires. He has lost, this afternoon, everything he came into this room believing he still stood to gain, and I have found, in 15 years of keeping accounts, that a debt fully called in need not also be made a cruelty. Let the record show the truth. I do not require Mr. Gray's ruin to be satisfied with it. It was mercy, and the room understood it as mercy precisely because it came from a woman who had, that afternoon, proven beyond any further argument that she could have asked for a great deal more. Julian Harcourt, Duke of Halstead, stood at the back of that room throughout the whole of the proceeding, exactly where Eleanor had told him to stand, and said nothing until it was entirely finished, and it was only afterward, in the Corn Exchange's emptying stairwell, with Thomas beside her, and half the county still murmuring behind them, that he came to her at last and said the thing he had. This time not rehearsed at all. He is my heir, Julian said. That is not all that concerns me, and it was wrong of me to have said, that first day, that it was. I came because I have been a coward for 15 years, and because I love you both, and duty was never going to be reason enough to knock on your door. I am sorry it took me this long to know the difference. An apology, Eleanor said, is not the same as an explanation, my lord, and I will want both, at length, in private, before I decide anything further about what comes next between us. Today was for Thomas. It was for the county. It was not yet for you. I understand, he said, and she believed, for the first time, that he did. The explanation, when it came 3 days later, in the walled garden at Ashcombe Grange, in full, without a single sentence spared for his own comfort, the night his father had put the paper before him. The 11 years of telling himself the lie that he would undo it, the search he had finally begun the month after the old Duke's funeral, the year it had taken to trace her from the county she had first fled to the next, to Fenwick at last. He did not ask once to be forgiven for any of it. He simply told it, plainly, the way she had taught him honesty was done, and let her decide afterward what it was worth. That is the explanation, Eleanor said, when he had finished. I believe it. I want you to understand that believing it and forgiving it are not the same transaction, and I am not yet prepared to make the second. She folded her hands in her lap, the posture, he had learned by now, that meant she was about to state terms rather than feelings. If you wish there to be anything further between us, you will hear my conditions, and you will not negotiate them, because I did not build the last 15 years of my life to have them renegotiated by a man who has only just arrived to notice them. I am listening. I keep the agency at Ashcombe until Lady Instow's nephew comes of age and no longer requires me, whether or not I am by then your wife-in-law as well as in fact. I will not be made ornamental. Thomas's education, his friendships, the pace at which he comes to know you, and the dukedom both, those remain, until he is grown, decisions we make together, and you will not overrule me in them out of old habit, because I promise you I will notice, and I will name it the moment it happens. And you will not speak of duty to either of us again, as though it were the whole of the matter. It is not. It was never going to be enough, and I would rather you learn that now than have either of us discover it too late a second time. All right, Julian said. "All right, then," Eleanor said, and something in the exchange, brief and unornamented as it was, settled between them more firmly than any speech could have. There was, before the terms were entirely sealed, one further scene that mattered more to the county, if less to Eleanor privately than any of the rest. The old family steward, Mr. Higgins, who had carried the 7th Duke's papers back and forth to a young man's signing table 15 years before, and had lived since with the particular guilt of a servant who had known exactly what he was delivering, and had delivered it anyway, came to Ashcombe Grange unbidden, in his good coat, and stood in the hall with his hat in both hands, and asked to speak to her alone. "I could have told you what was in that paper before you signed nothing yourself," he said. "I knew what it was. I carried it. I told myself it was not my place to interfere between a duke and his son, and I have told myself that same lie every year since, and I find this year I can no longer make myself believe it." He turned the hat over once in his hands. "I am sorry, madam. It is 15 years too late to be worth much, but it is the truest thing I have to offer you." "It is worth something," Eleanor said, for having been said at all. "Miss Higgins, which is more than most men in your position ever manage. I do not hold a servant's obedience against him the way I hold a duke's cowardice against a duke. Go home. Sleep easier tonight than you have in 15 years. That is all the absolution I have to give, and I think, from the look of you, it will do." The proof, in the months that followed, was not made of speeches, because Eleanor had told Julian plainly, early on, that she had had a great deal of speeches from his family already, and had found them, on the whole, cheap compared to roofs mended and rents paid on time, and he had taken the lesson to heart with the thoroughness of a man determined not to be found wanting a second time. He came to Ashcombe 3 days out of every week that autumn, not to direct anything, but to learn it, to walk the drained meadow with Ketch and ask honestly ignorant questions about grazing rents and channel depth, to sit at the kitchen table with Thomas over a Latin exercise neither of them found easy, to move his own chair without remark. From the far end of the parlour to the place beside Eleanor's, a small thing, repeated often enough across enough ordinary evenings that it ceased, eventually to be a thing anyone in the house noticed happening at all. He learned to pour her tea before she asked for it. He learned, more slowly, to stop apologising for the 15 years, and simply to be present for the 16th, which she had told him, once, was worth a great deal more to her than any further accounting of the past. The relapse came in November, small and entirely predictable, the way she had told him it would. A tenant's cottage at Halstead Court needed a new roof before winter, and Julian, out of 15 years of habit no single autumn could fully unlearn, simply ordered it done and the tenant's rent adjusted to cover it, without consulting Eleanor at all, because it had never in his life occurred to him that a decision of that size required anyone's consent but his own. "You decided it alone," Eleanor said, when she learned of it, not angry, only precise. "That is the old pattern, Julian, not because the decision was wrong, it was the right decision, and kindly meant, but because you are learning, still, that a house run well is run by agreement, not by a duke's unilateral kindness, however well-intentioned. I will not have Thomas grow up believing that generosity excuses consultation. Not in this house, and not, eventually, in that one." "You're right," Julian said, and did not argue it, which she noted as the truer sign of change than the apology itself. "I'll have it undone and put properly before the estate agent, and before you, the way it should have been from the start." "That is all I am asking," she said. "Not perfection. Correction, freely made, the second time it matters." It was on a clear evening in early December, with the fires lit, and Thomas upstairs over a book he had claimed, unconvincingly, to still be reading, that Julian found her in the small study off the hall, going over Ashcombe's quarter accounts by candlelight, and stood in the doorway a long moment before he spoke. "I would not have you think," he said, "that I am asking you to marry a duke a second time, because a title requires an heir formally settled, though it does, and I will not pretend otherwise. I am asking because I have spent 6 months learning what it looks like when you are in a room, and what it looks like when you are not, and I find I would choose the first, every single day. For the rest of however many days I am given, whether or not any law required it of me at all, I would choose you. I have been choosing you, in every ordinary way I know how, for some months now, and I intend to go on choosing you for a great deal longer than that, if you will have me." "That is very nearly," Eleanor said, setting down her pen, an acceptable way of saying it. "I would say it plainer, if I knew a plainer way." "There is no plainer way," she said. "That will do." The wedding, when it came the following spring, was quiet, by her own insistence, in the same stone church 3 parishes from anywhere where Josiah Wren had once signed a register in his own steady hand, with Hannah Wren present in the second pew, and the same oilcloth-wrapped letter, framed now, hung afterward in the hall at Halstead Court, where any visitor might read it who cared to ask what it was. 2 years passed the way years do, when a household has finally stopped holding its breath. Ashcombe Grange, under a new agent Eleanor had trained herself and left the running of, returned a surplus larger than any in its recorded history. Josiah Ketch was made head bailiff of the drained meadow, at a wage he had never in his life expected a Harcourt to volunteer without being asked, and the fair wage practice Eleanor had begun there, every man paid in full, on the day promised, witnessed and recorded, was written, at her insistence, into the standing instructions of every property the dukedom held, a small clause, in a large ledger, that would outlast every person who had argued over it. A school was opened in the village at Fenwick that autumn, for tenants' children of either sex, funded from the estate's own surplus and staffed, in its first year, by Hannah Wren herself, who had found, she said, that she preferred teaching children to read a register to selling them paper to write on. Silas Grey, having lost the dukedom, and very nearly his standing besides, took the correction Eleanor had spared him, and did, in the end, something with it. He sold the small property that remained to him under the entail, removed to the north with what dignity his sister could persuade him to keep, and wrote, once, a short letter to Ashcombe Grange that Eleanor read, filed among the accounts rather than burned, because she had learned long ago that even a poor debtor's ledger was worth keeping accurate. Cecilia Grey, who had come to Eleanor quietly the week before the hearing with what she knew of her brother's forged seal, and had asked nothing for herself in the giving of it, stayed on in the county, married a curate 2 years later, and was, by all accounts, glad to have her own name spoken of, for something other than her brother's undoing. Thomas turned 16 that winter, tall now, steadier in the shoulders than the boy who had once braced both hands against a door-frame and refused to move, and wore the small signet openly, resized at last to fit a grown hand, not hidden beneath any collar or any ribbon, but plain on his finger where any man in the county could see it and know exactly what it meant. He had asked, the day the goldsmith finished the resizing, whether it changed anything, wearing it where people could see. It changes what it means, Eleanor told him, not what it is. It was proof once, kept in the dark, because the dark was the only safe place for it. Now it is simply yours, worn in the light, because you decided, of your own will, that you wanted it seen. That is the whole difference, Thomas. Everything else is just gold. Halstead Court, in those 2 years, stopped being the cold, held-breath sort of house it had been under the 7th Duke's long shadow, and became, room by ordinary room, the kind of house where doors were left open in summer, and a boy's muddy boots were tolerated by the front hall without comment, and Julian, more than once, standing in a doorway of his own at the end of a long day, remarked to no one in particular that the house seemed, lately, to breathe differently than it once had, as though something that had been held tight in its walls for 15 years had finally been permitted to let go. He did not say it as a figure of speech. Eleanor, hearing him say it the second time, understood that he meant it exactly. She kept, still, her private ledger, the plain calf bound one with the second set of pages at the back, though she wrote in it now, more often than not, ordinary entries rather than evidence, a boy's examination results, a harvest yield, a wage paid on time to a man who had once doubted whether a woman could keep her word. Her father's old maxim sat at the top of the very first page. In her own hand, the ink long since gone the soft brown of age. Land will tell you the truth if you know how to look at it, and paper will tell you the truth if you know how to keep it. Beneath it, years later, in a steadier hand than the one that had first written it down, she had added a second line of her own, and a man will tell you the truth, in the end, the same way, not in what he says on the day it costs him nothing, but in what he keeps doing on all the ordinary days after. She had stopped, long before any of this was settled, asking to be seen. She had made herself, instead, impossible to unsee. One drained meadow, and one honest ledger, and one composed refusal at a time, and that was not a thing any duke, any cousin, any paper drawn up in a locked room could ever take from her again. A boy is not made a son by the blood he is born with, but by the choosing of him, over and over, on every unwitnessed ordinary day that no one keeps a record of but the people who lived them. A man is not redeemed by the apology he finally manages to speak aloud, but by the roof he mends without being asked to, the chair he moves a little closer, the decision he learns, slowly, not to make alone. And a woman is not rescued by the return of the ones who once called her useful rather than loved. She rescues herself first, in the long, unremarkable years no one is watching, and what comes back to her after, if anything ever does, comes back only because she built a life so plainly undeniable that even the men who once signed her away had, in the end, no honest choice left but to reckon with it.